CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories: 5 people are killed and 34 injured after Russian missiles strike an apartment block in the Ukrainian city of Lviv. Our other headlines: the exiled Wagner chief is back in Russia. So says the Belarusian president. We'll be reporting from Moscow. And United States Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen begins her visit to China as the two countries seek to find some common ground. At least 5 people are now reported killed and over 30 injured in a missile strike on the Ukrainian city of Lviv. The attack, which hit an apartment block, came in the early hours of Thursday while residents were asleep. Ukraine says 7 of the 10 Russian missiles launched on Lviv were shot down. This has been called one of the deadliest strikes on a civilian target in Ukraine since this conflict began. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Stephanie Freed in Dnipro. Stephanie, what more do we know about this attack?
Well, Jamie, a lot of what you're reporting is being reported here. 5 people have been killed, dozens injured, and dozens of apartments destroyed in this hit. This rescue workers are searching beneath the rubble, perhaps for more survivors or for people who didn't survive this hit. And what Ukraine is saying is that these were cruise missiles. They were Caliber. Wait one second, Caliber missiles that were fired by Russia from the sea onto Lviv, and that they intercepted 7 of those. 3 were not intercepted. And as you said, Jamie, this is the biggest hit on Lviv since the start of this 16-month campaign. Lviv was mostly pretty much unscathed. It has been a place where international workers, rescue workers, humanitarian workers, journalists sometimes stay because of its relative. It was thought to be relatively safe, very close to the Polish border. Ukraine's President Zelensky in Bulgaria today on Thursday, vowing that there will be retribution, and repeatedly to remind viewers, President Zelensky has criticized a slow Western stream of support in terms of weapons, and attributing that to the fact that Ukraine is unable to adequately defend itself. Jamie?
Lviv is, as you've been saying, Ukraine's most westerly city and had pretty much stayed out of the fighting so far. What do you think is the significance of this latest strike?
Well, you know, if you look at it, literally the message is that no city is safe. This was considered a very safe haven, again, where people would go and organizations would place their people. So the strike, if you look at the caliber and its level of accuracy, which is predicted to be around a 50-meter accuracy rate, which is pretty small, and then you read between the lines on that of intention, there possibly is a message there. And so again, I'd go back to that no major city, no place really is safe in Ukraine, and that's the way Ukrainians would be reading that as well, I would guess. Jamie?
Stephanie, thank you for that. Our correspondent Stephanie Freed in Dnipro. The leader of the Wagner group of mercenary fighters, Yevgeny Prigozhin, is back in Russia. That's according to the leader of Belarus. President Alexander Lukashenko says Prigozhin, who led the failed uprising against Moscow 2 weeks ago, has returned to his hometown of St. Petersburg. The Wagner chief, who'd been offered exile in Belarus, has not been seen in public since he called off his rebellion against Moscow's military leadership. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow. Dasha, what has President Lukashenko had to say?
Well, indeed, we have for Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, confirming that Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Wagner mercenary group, was no longer in Belarus, where he was actually in late June. Lukashenko suggested that Prigozhin could be in St. Petersburg, he could be taking his jet and traveling to other parts of Russia. He said he was a free man who can make his choices. But at the same time, we've heard from the Kremlin saying that Moscow is not tracking the location of Yevgeny Prigozhin. They neither have the capacity nor the desire to do so. That's according to Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov. Just to remind you quickly, the terms of the deal that has been brokered by Alexander Lukashenko on the 24th of June during the Wagner mutiny was that Prigozhin himself goes to Belarus and his fighters would not be prosecuted in one way or another, but instead will be offered to sign contracts with Russia's Ministry of Defense should they be willing to do so. So it's unclear now. The relocation process has been underway, and Lukashenko has been suggesting that the fighters of the Wagner group could be taking the military compounds in Belarus. But also Lukashenko has been saying that he not only brokered the deal between the Wagner and the Kremlin, but also suggested to broker the deal between Kiev and Moscow, saying that now it is the time when Moscow is ready to negotiate with Kiev. But then he said that Kiev is waiting until the end of its counteroffensive, and he said that it's not clear whether Moscow will be willing to talk to Kiev by the end of this counteroffensive. And also he was talking about the Russian tactical nuclear weapons that have been stationed in Belarus, suggesting that those will not be used in the course of the ongoing special military operation in Ukraine, but rather are acting as the counterweight should there be any sort of threat coming from the Western countries against Belarus.
What do you think the situation is now with the Wagner group and those forces who joined the uprising?
Well, as we have heard from Lukashenko, it's the situation when the Wagner group has been offered the military compounds, the abandoned Soviet compounds in Belarus. This offer is still on the table, but he suggested that the Wagner fighters could have a different vision of the situation, in his words. He also said that the majority of the fighters of the Wagner group have been in their permanent camps in the Lugansk People's Republic, suggesting that this is where they have been deployed after the pullout from Bakhmut. But as we understand, it's unclear whether they will be joining the Russian Ministry of Defense to continue to participate in the ongoing special military operation. That's a big question. But at the same time, Lukashenko has stressed that should those fighters come to Belarus, they will certainly be in a position to help the Belarusian military by the experience they have in combat activities. But also, he said, should there be any aggression against Belarus from the Western countries, he said that was one of the conditions under which Belarus has invited those fighters to their country.
Dasha, thank you for that. Our correspondent Dasha Chonashova in Moscow. Senior officials from Turkey, Sweden and Finland are meeting at NATO headquarters in Brussels to try and clear the way for Stockholm's membership bid. This comes ahead of a leaders' summit in Lithuania next week. Despite neighbouring Finland joining the military alliance in April, Turkey and Hungary have yet to ratify Sweden's membership. Let's talk now to our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels. Alex, so Sweden making efforts to meet Turkey's demands. Is that going to be enough for Turkey to lift its blocking, to lift its opposition?
Not yet, in a word, Jamie. The meeting has actually just wrapped up a few moments ago. We heard from NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, who hosted the foreign ministers and the intelligence chiefs from Finland, Sweden and Turkey in that meeting. And so far, no green light from Turkey on lifting their opposition. Now, they still have issues about protest, anti-Turkish government protests, pro-Kurdish protests being allowed to take place in Sweden. They also condemned the burning of a Quran at a protest just last week in Stockholm, something that was allowed and not stopped by the Swedish courts. Now, there's a conflict there within Sweden between its desire to join NATO and its desire to stand up for its rule of law and its freedom of expression. That is one of the tensions in this situation. Now, Jens Stoltenberg also said that he will convene a meeting of Turkish President Erdogan on Monday. That's a day before the NATO Leaders Summit in Vilnius, and Ulf Kristersson, the Swedish Prime Minister. They will meet, the three leaders will meet in Vilnius ahead of the summit to try to hash out that deal. Now, is it possible? Will it lead to an agreement, lead to the approval of Sweden joining? Well, it is absolutely possible to have a positive decision, says Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO. So we'll just have to wait until next week to get a clarity on whether or not Sweden will finally be allowed to join NATO.
Alex, we're just watching live pictures of Jens Stoltenberg, NATO's Secretary General, taking questions at the press conference. What can we expect from this big meeting of NATO leaders in Lithuania next week?
Well, this issue of Sweden will certainly be on the agenda. Trying to get that deal over the line will be a priority for Jens Stoltenberg. He said just a few moments ago at that press conference that we can see the pictures of that Sweden has done everything that it agreed to do back in Madrid last year in a memorandum signed by the Turkish authorities, the Finns and the Swedes, and therefore he thinks it's time for Sweden to be allowed to join. That is also the sentiment from Joe Biden, who met with the Swedish Prime Minister yesterday, reiterating his very, very strong support for Sweden to join the alliance. But it's important to note Sweden is in many ways already a de facto member of NATO. They are aligned on military terms, they're aligned on the democratic priorities, and they are surrounded by all sides by NATO members. And so that will be one of the things that allows the Swedes to be a bit more patient. Other things on the agenda: long-term plan of support for Ukraine that you would expect, looking at those F-16 training programs being put in place by NATO members over the summer, and potential deliveries of F-16s and Gripen, Swedish Gripen fighter jets after that. And finally, the collective defense of the NATO alliance on its territory in Europe, in the North Atlantic. The first time in decades that the alliance has put together very elaborate plans to defend its territory, and that will be discussed and signed off by the leaders at the summit next week.
Alex, thank you for that. Our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels. Israel's military says it has fired artillery shells into Lebanon after 2 rockets were fired across the border. One of the rockets is reported to have landed in Lebanese territory, with the other landing in a disputed area. There was no claim of responsibility for the original rocket fire and no immediate comment from the Lebanese army. This all comes after Israel concluded a large-scale military operation in the Jenin refugee camp, in which 12 Palestinians and an Israeli soldier were killed. At least 17 people, including several children, have been killed by a leak of poisonous gas in a South African shantytown near Johannesburg. Several other victims were resuscitated, and investigations are underway to determine the cause. Initial reports suggest the leak could be linked to illegal mining. A child has died and several others injured after a car crashed into a primary school in southwest London. The driver, a woman in her 40s, has been arrested on suspicion of causing death by dangerous driving. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is in Beijing for a 4-day visit, her first trip to China since taking up the role in President Biden's administration. This comes as the world's 2 biggest economies seek to try to find common ground and improve diplomatic relations. Our correspondent Dong Shui reports.
Yellen is expected to meet with her Chinese counterpart and senior Chinese officials, as well as leaders of American companies here in Beijing. She has said repeatedly that she'd like to visit China when the time is appropriate. According to a statement by the U.S. Treasury Department, Yellen's visit follows directives by President Biden and President Xi after their meeting on the Indonesian island of Bali last November. Also on the agenda of Yellen's talks with the Chinese officials in Beijing is the issues of responsibly managing the U.S.-China relationship and working together to address global challenges with a view to find ways the 2 countries can work together. And ahead of her trip to Beijing, Yellen met with the China's ambassador to the U.S., Xie Feng, in Washington, where the 2 officials held a frank and productive discussions, and that's according to the official readouts. Well, analysts here in Beijing said no major breakthroughs are expected for the Beijing trip, as China and the U.S. maintain very different positions on technology, trade, and currency. Well, for example, the U.S. had placed significant limitations on advanced semiconductors and chip-making machinery that can be sent to China, which obviously hampered the industry's development here in China.
China's President Xi Jinping has sent a congratulatory message to mark the 70th anniversary of the so-called ice-breaking mission, the first Western trade delegation to the People's Republic of China. The group of British entrepreneurs was led by Jack Perry, and it paved the way in opening up trade between China and the UK. President Xi noted in 7 decades, business between the 2 countries has grown to over $100 billion a year. He urged the pioneering spirit to continue as the countries face current global challenges. Well, 70 years ago, Jack Perry led that group of intrepid British business people to China to try to reopen trade. His son, Stephen Perry, chairman of the 48 Group Club in the UK, explains how the icebreakers helped change global markets forever.
I'm Stephen Perry and I'm chairman of London Export Corporation and chairman of the 48 Group Club. My father's first visit to China was 1953, and in 1951-52 he met with Zhou Enlai's private secretary, personal emissary, who came to London to ask people in Cambridge for advice on somebody who could reopen trade with China. And for a man who'd never really been out of the East End of London, it was an incredible experience and an incredible opportunity. The original icebreaker mission, it was people from lots of different ranges of life, and people from lots of businesses who wanted to open up or restart their businesses with China. There were 19 of them, and they signed an agreement, and it was all carried out. I joined right after I was president of my students' union, and I went to Beijing in 1972, 50 years ago now, and I was part of the group that sold the first commodities from America to China. And being around the Nixon mission and that background made me feel a part of history. And soon after that I went to work in America to build trade between America and China. And it was just fascinating learning about America and learning about China and finding ways to bring the two countries together in trade. It was ice-breaking, but it was, in a sense, it was very easy because it was so enjoyable. I met such interesting people. What I decided was my main mission, to understand China and how it worked. And that's been a long journey. It's been 20, 30 years. I had no idea in 1978 the Chinese were going to transform agriculture and mechanize it and move 800 million people off the land into towns and cities and build the biggest export industry in the world. I think I probably irritate people because I say to them, you don't understand what these people are like. They have the best grasp of what it is they want to do, and it's based in reality, not in fantasy. And then they go out and they do it, and they test it, and they change, and they alter. But they're absolutely committed to being the most advanced, modernized economy by 2049. People like us said, you can't join WTO, your markets will be taken over by foreigners. And they would smile and say, thank you for telling us. But they did. So with the WTO entry, everybody thought it would be a real difficult time for China. Actually, China drove straight into the middle of it and became the largest exporting nation. If you're not trying to achieve win-win, then you're going to have trouble in China. And I say to Chinese who come out of China looking to win, you won't succeed. Unless you can work out how to work with the foreigner, you're going to find it very difficult. It is a different concept of business. Most businesses are operating on the basis of win. But China has a much better understanding of what win-win means. It's not just a phrase, it's a reality of something that will be sustained. The bridge building project, the CGTN, is giving us a great deal of opportunity to reflect upon. It is only by this type of thinking that we're going to find out what works. If we all knew what would work, we would all do it. But there has to be exploration, and we have to give people their head in order to try different things. You know, the Chinese have a view that the world can only work if the countries of the world work together, and that the days of empires are past. And they genuinely believe that if they try to be an empire, they will fail. If we understand that China is going to be the trendsetter of the next 20 or 30 years, that is the country which we need to get alongside and to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. It'll transform the world.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, a look into the future as the World Artificial Intelligence Conference begins in Shanghai. And out with a bang, Europe bills a fond farewell to the Ariane 5 rocket for the final time.
Roger, making it loud and clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Awesome!
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN, see the difference.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. At least 5 people are killed and more than 30 injured after Russian missiles strike this apartment block in the Ukrainian city of Lviv. Our other headlines: the exiled Wagner chief is back in Russia, so says the Belarusian president. And the United States Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen begins her visit to China as the two superpowers seek to try to find some common ground. The World Artificial Intelligence Conference has started in Shanghai with a host of groundbreaking new products. This year's event is particularly focused on the technology behind generative AI like ChatGPT. Our correspondent Wu Lei reports.
There are so many creative AI products and solutions inside this vast exhibition area. One of the highlights is that both domestic and international tech companies are showcasing over 30 what are known as large language generative AI models to the public. Let's try using some of them. With the help of cloud computing, deep learning, and a generative AI model, this Sense Mirage can create pictures on a few keywords. For example, aliens, big eyes in outer space. Here we go. Powered by several large language AI models, this office suit can write an article, summarize the key points, and even make a PowerPoint. Besides generative applications, AI has been applied in more industries like healthcare, education, and manufacturing. This is a simulated smart construction site. The intelligent excavator and the tower crane have been equipped with smart cameras, laser radar, and other environmental sensors. They can work for 24 hours a day and complete dangerous tasks without human involvement.
Large language models may be the foundation. Then on the basis of this large model, we also need more professional models in different sectors. Our AI solutions have been more widely used in transportation, ports, aviation, and other fields.
But how to improve the overall computing capacity of AI chips? What about data security and the regulation of AI in key industries? Challenges remain as entrepreneurs, scholars, and decision makers continue their discussions at panels and forums over the 3-day event. Wu Lei, CGTN, Shanghai.
The United Nations is hosting a conference to show how robots could be used to achieve the organization's human development goals. The event is showcasing humanoids with social and caregiving skills, as well as ones that can carry out industrial tasks. A panel of robots will give the world's first humanoid press conference on Friday. Let's hope it isn't too robotic. Europe's Ariane 5 rocket has blasted off for the final time, carrying 2 military satellites into orbit, taking off from French Guiana after a quarter of a century of service. It leaves the European Space Agency without independent access to space for the first time in over 40 years. The first test launch of Ariane 6 is expected next year. Well, let's talk to Robert Massey, Deputy Executive Director at the Royal Astronomical Society, and I'm delighted to say he joins us from the National Astronomy Gathering in Cardiff. Robert, good to see you. Thanks very much for coming on the programme and nipping out of your exciting conference. This is an end of an era, I guess. I mean, what should we make of today? A red-letter day.
Yeah, I mean, look, this day was obviously going to come because no technology, no system lasts forever and it gets replaced. But it does have a great legacy. I mean, this is a system that had 117 launches, famously a streak of 82 successive launches without a failure over a period of 14 years. Really a very reliable workhorse system. And we should remember it did things like it launched ESA's first mission to the moon, Smart 1, back in 2003. It launched JWST, with the hugely famous James Webb Space Telescope just over a year and a half ago, and that's been clearly enormously successful. And it also did things like, another highlight is the automated transfer vehicle, a kind of robotic vehicle that delivered packages to the space station. And alongside that, obviously, there were numerous commercial clients. It's worth remembering that ESA markets Arianespace, providing that as well.
Robert, for those of us who are not distinguished astronomers, you almost make it sound like a taxi, but that's kind of what it is, isn't it?
It's certainly a taxi for delivering things into orbit. Yeah, I mean, it's not the cheapest taxi. I don't think we're going to be in a position where you've got an app on your phone just to put things into space for a few quid. But yes, I mean, it is that workhorse. It's that sort of. I've never seen a space launch. I've seen televised space launches. It's a doubtless tremendous thing to see, but there is an element of routine about it as well. Certainly from the spaceport in French Guiana at Kourou. Alongside this, you can reflect on the fact that technology is in some ways, the principle is quite old, using similar propulsion systems, more or less, to the ones that were in use in the 1960s. There's probably more regulation now around, say, the environmental impact on those, and yes, more sophistication in the way they work. I suppose if there was a change of some kind, and you might want to talk about this too, it's that we've recently seen SpaceX ramping up the reusability of some of the components, which I think is a really important change, where you get the stages coming back to the launch pad and slowly reducing the costs as well.
And we have to wait till next year for the test launch of Ariane 6. What is the step change? What is the leap in progress? Can you give us an idea?
Well, I mean, look, it's still a rocket. It's still using boosters and so on, but it does have a larger capacity. And if you want, I mean, from a scientist's perspective, if you want to put missions into interplanetary space, for example, then more powerful launchers are helpful for that. It's not so important for many commercial uses, although you can deliver multiple satellites at once, which actually also is something that SpaceX does a lot. But I think it is important that Europe has its own capacity too. I mean, some of the member states, like the UK, is trying to build up a launch system. But I genuinely think, no, we need that European heavy launch system. That kind of autonomy is very important. We shouldn't really be dependent entirely on the US. I mean, relations obviously and hopefully for the foreseeable future are much better with the US than they are with, say, Roscosmos, where that's no longer an option. But I think it is really important that member countries of ESA, including the UK, have that access.
Robert, good to see you, and thank you very much for sneaking out of your conference. Robert Massey, Deputy Executive Director at the Royal Astronomical Society, joining us from that National Astronomy meeting in Cardiff. Now, Twitter, take note. Threads is in town. Meta has thrown down the gauntlet to its rival with the launch of its new app, Threads, seeking to take advantage of its rival's perceived beleaguered state since being taken over by Elon Musk. The platform hoovered up millions of new users in its first hours, including the celebrities Kim Kardashian and Jennifer Lopez. And that is The World Today. Thank you for watching. We're back with more news at the top of this hour. Coming up next is World Insight. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.